All right, hi. Let's get this last lecture in the books, wrap up this course. Not necessarily the happiest and most uplifting of topics to cover here to wrap up a course, but nevertheless, I think it's an important one, uh, both under the concept context of the course itself, the psychology of aging, a part of aging, a necessary part of life in general, of course, is dealing with our own mortality and the effects that this has on a person. And so we want to understand the psychology then of the dying role, we could call it here. Let's talk about that. So not every life ends in this way, but for a number of people, we end up with potentially some sort of a terminal illness, a terminal diagnosis, and we have some potentially known but largely sometimes unknown amount of time left. And of course, such things can happen to a person at essentially any age of life. But as we've noted several times in this course, these sorts of things are more likely to be happening for older adults. And we've talked about social roles. And one of the social roles, when we talked about this, we talked about things like the grandparenting role and the retirement role or retiree role and things of this. And we've looked at role transition and role conflict and role exit and so on and so forth. And one role that we didn't talk much about is called the sick role. And again, this is something that can affect someone at any stage of life. The sick role is that once you get diagnosed with an illness, doesn't have to be a terminal illness, right? It could just be any sort of chronic illness that a person may have to deal with. This changes a lot about your life, right? There are lots of things that you might have to start coping with, such as an increased number of visits to the doctor. You may have to go to a specialist, and you may have to start doing this every month or every 3 months. Of course, it just depends on the nature of the illness and what the doctors want. You may have to go for a variety of different tests on a regular basis, whether it's imaging or blood work or what have you. You now have a lot of changes to your life as a result of this. This means you've got a lot to spend more time sitting around with your calendar and calling offices and making appointments and taking time to go to these appointments and dealing with the extra costs of going to all of these medical appointments. And now maybe you also have a lot of medicine to take, and you've got to get one of those big pill organizers to remind you to take all these different regimens of medicine, morning, noon, and night, perhaps. So all of these changes to kind of who we are as a person and the way that we live our lives, which also can sometimes affect a family member, a spouse, or anyone that we live with in terms of a caregiver role, or just in general, we can talk about what's called a family illness, right? And so a family illness means that when a person has a serious, especially chronic illness, it doesn't necessarily just affect them, but it affects their close family as well. And so that's the sick role. But when this kind of situation turns into a terminal diagnosis, and the person now knows that the diagnosis that they have is going to lead to their own ending at some point, relatively soon at least, right? That takes on a whole new dimension when it comes to how it influences the kinds of things that we have to start doing with ourselves, right? So one perspective on this is that certainly it places an impact on how we think about the future. When for most of our lives, we think about the future. Maybe not literally thinking that we have an unlimited amount of time. We all know intellectually that we have a finite amount of time to live our lives, but especially when we're younger, we can almost essentially not worry about that kind of stuff, right? That we feel like there's so much time left in my life, even though, of course, we know that none of it's promised and that something terrible could happen at any given day. Of course, again, we don't go around usually thinking too much about that sort of stuff, right? So, so that means we make plans for the future, right? We think about, well, what am I going to be doing with myself in the next 20 years, right? What do I see myself? What do I see my life like in 20 years time or 30 years time and so forth? And those kinds of thoughts about ourselves And that's a way of thinking about your self-concept, by the way, is that when we think about our self-concept, we might think about things like who am I as a person, what are my personality traits, and what is my career, and what do I do, and all this sort of stuff. But another part of our self-concept is our autobiographical past, as well as our potential autobiographical future, right? What kind of person do I see myself becoming, and what kind of life do I see myself leading into the future? So that component of your self-concept is now changed, right? Once you have this terminal illness, you no longer are necessarily going to need to think about the future and to that extent, and the kinds of personal growth and plans and ideas that you had for your future self may now be off the table. So this is a form of role transition and role exit here, right? As opposed to being a person living into the future, now I'm a dying person, and that's a major change to your self-concept, right? So that's part of our dying role here, right? So this is what it falls under kind of what I'm talking about there as part of the personal aspects of this here. I mentioned already the relational aspect of it, right? How this has an effect on our family and our friends. Practical things, besides the whole thing about going to doctor's appointments, but when it comes specifically to end of life decisions, right now we have to talk about making sure you have a living will and in an actual will and all of these things related to what happens if you become incapacitated and do you want to make a do not resuscitate order and these sorts of things. So you have to make all these kinds of decisions about how you want to handle these matters and how you want everything to be handled after you pass, as well as dealing with the financial impacts of, what happens to your estate and all these things, all the legal and financial implications of that. So all of these decisions, right, have to be made. So this is part of now your new role. You have to be the person to make these choices. Um, Now, getting back to that idea about the personal side of things and how this impacts our self-concept, at this point, we might think that this could be difficult, very difficult to deal with. And is there any role for therapy to help us cope with this kind of adaptation, right? That's what I've titled this slide, right? We have to adapt to this new position and role that we find ourselves in. So there is such a thing as dignity therapy, right? And so dignity therapy is kind of as the name implies, right? We're looking to find a sense of dignity and or meaning in our own life, right? Sort of accepting the fact that um, I've lived my life and the things that I've achieved are the things that I have achieved, and there might not be very much more of that that's going to happen, but I can accept and find meaning in what I have done with my life. And that, of course, means that I can approach end of life decisions then with the acceptance that I'm okay with all of those things, right? As you see, some of the details here focus just on that, right? So it involves these guided interviews where a person is really invited to reflect on all of the various roles that they did occupy throughout their entire life, right? So what was that career? What was your role as a maybe as a parent or as a partner slash spouse to another person or as a sibling, right? So your relationships as roles to other people. What are the most significant things that happened in your life? Impactful and emotional memories. What are the major lessons and things that you want to pass on to your family? A lot of times this involves, you may have seen these things where people make these videos, right? Where they kind of have a video for someone to watch later after they've passed. And so they're leaving kind of big picture lessons and other messages that they want to pass on. Sometimes, of course, it can take the form of letters or maybe importantly, it can take the form of just a face-to-face conversation before you pass away is another good way to do this. But taking the time during the therapy to figure out what those things are, and so that you can start to do this, that also gives you some actual goals to achieve and feel like you're really still continuing to pass something on into the future, even if you're no longer around. So as we note here at the bottom, then this really helps someone have a stronger sense of identity, even though they're losing a lot of what was a major part of their self-concept before. It helps affirm what was what has happened, right? And therefore, it creates that stronger connection to others. And also, what's critical here is autonomy. So the autonomy business, this is something that connects to a theory we haven't said much about, I don't think, in this course, called self-determination theory. And it's maybe pretty relevant here. So it's relevant in a lot of different contexts of life, but self-determination theory says that it makes a distinction between the intrinsic motivation to do something versus the extrinsic motivation, right? So extrinsic rewards would be things that are part of extrinsic motivation, like taking a job because it pays a lot of money. But intrinsic motivations and rewards relates to doing something because you just love doing it. And what self-determination theory tries to get at and tries to understand is what what is it that actually makes something intrinsically motivating? I can say that I just enjoy doing something and that's why I do it, but what actually makes me enjoy doing it? And so one of the core themes in this is that there are three needs that everyone needs to have met, and so these are needs for autonomy, needs for connectedness, and needs for competence. And so what this refers to here, let me do that in reverse order. We'll end with autonomy. Um, Competence means I like to know what I'm doing. I like to feel like I know what I'm doing. And so, of course, in the case of the dying role, that means that the dignity therapy is going to help someone understand the challenges that they have to go through, right? So no one gets any training on how to make end of life decisions, right? And how to do all these things. So getting a little education on how all of this works and how to approach these decisions and how to approach your family and how talk to your family about all of these things, it helps to have a little bit of support there, right? So we have a need to feel competent even as we move towards our own mortality. So that's a big thing. We have a need for connectedness to others, right? And that potentially is self-explanatory. We don't want to feel that we're alone and going through this whole thing alone. And then the need for autonomy means self-control. I'm in charge. I can make my own decisions here. And other people aren't making decisions for me. I can do it for myself. Not everyone is in a situation where they can do that, depending on their mental state and the exact nature of whatever their illness might be. But certainly to the extent that it's possible, having that feeling of autonomy is critically important here, right? People don't want to feel like they are losing control of everything as they pass on, right? So these are critical considerations here for helping people adapt to this situation. Now, there are other theories of adaptation here that we might want to talk about. And one way to categorize these theories is to talk about them as either linear theories or dynamic theories. The famous linear theory helps us understand why it's called linear in the first place, right? So these are the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. And so I have the stages right here, right? The idea is that once you receive a terminal diagnosis and you start to then have to cope with this and adapt to this, the first thing that might happen is that you are in denial, right? It's still early, so you think, I don't have to worry about this, right? Eventually, you realize you can't deny it anymore. You might become angry and bitter. Uh, and then you get kind of transactional. And maybe if I do this, or if I do this, I might be able to extend or prolong or do something. And then depression sets in. Ultimately, then you accept it, right? So this is a useful, potentially, way of thinking about how people go through these different phases and emotions. And one of the ways it's useful is that this means that it's possible for us to anticipate what someone might go through as they are facing their own mortality. Now, there are some concerns here, right? So one of the concerns is that this is not necessarily universal. Um, so, not everyone goes through all of these five stages. Sometimes they don't go through them, but maybe they go through them, but in a different order. They skip around. They don't necessarily, maybe they go backwards, right? So it's not something that we can always say is it's going to unfold exactly like this. But nevertheless, having an awareness that any one of these five states could be a state that a person with a terminal illness finds themselves in. Certainly, it's useful from a psychologist's perspective to anticipate and understand and recognize when someone is in one of these particular kinds of states here. Another example of a linear theory is called crisis theory. And what's happening here, this is more of a single event kind of situation where what happens is you're going to uh, you're you get the diagnosis or you have some major health event or health scare, and this is a crisis. And this then serves as a single event that triggers the onset of some new major shift in your life and how you're coping and how you're adapting to the whole situation. And it treats it as a one-time kind of thing that you're going through that one crisis and it's going to be transient and you're going to adapt, and then that's it, right? So again, maybe this idea that it's really just this one big event that happens and it's kind of over and done with is oversimplifying the situation a little bit here. Similar to this is the cognitive adaptation theory, which really is very much like crisis theory, except that it provides a little bit more detail on exactly what those kinds of coping efforts might look like. So the idea of searching for meaning. I think I might have mentioned this in the previous video that uh, searching for meaning involves something where whenever we're suffering and we're going through something that's very, very difficult, sometimes we might try to realize that um, even though this is terrible right now, I'm going to gain something from it. And that helps me now find meaning in my suffering because I realize that I'm going to come out of this a better person, a stronger person, and so forth. And that can be very challenging when we go through very significant uh, difficult problems in our lives. And that's when we talked about stress, that's where the challenge is. And in this situation, finding meaning in your own end of life is perhaps even more challenging because you can't really say those things where I'm going to come out of this a stronger person because you're not coming out of it, right? So what you have to now do is you have to accept mortality and realize this is almost like an existential philosophy and existential psychology kind of a thing, right? That it's when we talk about the meaning of life, you could point to some of the existential philosophers and who might say something like, well, the meaning of life is ultimately that we're going to die. So we have to choose our own meaning in life and make something of our lives. And so that means sort of like with this dignity therapy, reflecting on what did I achieve with my life? And so this now motivates us, right? Once we get this diagnosis and it forms this crisis, I'm going to start coping by searching for meaning in my life, right? To reflect and try to figure out what did I do with myself, right? And am I okay with all of this sort of stuff? Um, Related to everything I just said about self-determination theory, right? We're going to try to find a sense of competence here. I'm going to try to learn. I'm going to try to figure out what's happening to me and what do I need to do. I also want autonomy again, right? I want to feel that I can make my own decisions, and this is going to help then increase my self-esteem. That if I feel that I can still make my own decisions and still be myself, I can feel better about myself in this regard. So the criticisms, as I've already sort of laid them out here, right? These are stage models, especially the Kubler-Ross one. And not all stage models really work out well, right? So stage models generally have the assumption that people go through stages in a certain order and they don't go backwards, which is called regression, and they don't skip stages. And the data tell us that this looks very different in reality, right? So at best, the Kubler-Ross stages are an approximation, not a literal universal truth. Um, Part of the issue too is that stage models give the impression of what we'll call discrete changes, right? So that you're in one phase and then you just shift discretely suddenly into another phase. And personal change rarely happens this way. Even when we go back to thinking about child development and think about like Piaget's stages of cognitive development, that's quite a simplification as well, right? That the changes of cognitive ability in childhood are not sudden and dramatic as you graduate from one stage to another, but rather it's very slow and gradual and continuous. What else we want to say here? Individual differences. So people's personality differences and their cultural background are certainly going to influence how they deal with these kinds of situations. Um, and also this idea of a disease trajectory. What am I talking about here? That means that people die for different reasons and have different kinds of terminal diagnoses. And how that happens, how it progresses, how fast does it progress, what are the symptoms, and how debilitating are they in terms of affecting things like activities of daily living or instrumental ADLs. Um, all of those things look different from person to person to person. So that means that, and of course, part of this is that sometimes these changes, especially when it comes to how the disease is progressing, can go very slowly and consistently and progress at a very consistent rate. And so that might mean that you could then cope and adapt at an equally consistent rate. But sometimes sudden changes happen, right? So a sudden complication occurs and then everything gets worse. So that means that the rate at which you actually have to cope is not a consistent linear. What one is sometimes there will be sudden increases in your need for how much coping you have to apply, whereas other times it's a little less. And so this can change quite a bit from month to month, year to year, as we deal with these kinds of issues here. Related to that, then, is the idea is that adjustment, unlike what crisis theory says, is not a one-time event, right? It's recurrent, meaning it's going to continue to happen again and again, and new developments happen, and it's always happening in a different context in terms of what's going on in my life right now and what's going on with my condition right now. All of these things are dynamically changing all the time. Likewise, our emotional states are always dynamically changing, right? How we're able to emotionally deal with the whole situation, and of course we're going through and we're learning new coping skills and trying them out, and we're adapting and changing these coping styles. So that's going to fluctuate constantly. So, and of course we learn more, right, as we go to the doctor, and of course our need for competence means that we might do some reading up on our own condition. So as all of this information gets updated over time, again, that's going to influence our cognitions. Again, this is all dynamically changing here as well. So understanding the dynamic nature of adjustment and adaptation is perhaps pretty critical here, right? So here we want to capture the biopsychosocial model again, right? To come back to that term. So what we're looking at here is the idea that we're going to have changes in the body, right? With the disease progression and symptomology and ADLs. There can be changes in our social environment, right? So our relationships with others changes, and access to coping resources is going to change. So these are all biopsychosocial influences on us as we face end of life situations. Um, and a few things worth talking about here, right? So this idea of uh, adjustment being transactional. So what does this mean? Uh, so the reciprocity relation between stress and coping, what this is referring to is the idea that as these situations cause stress, the stress levels are sometimes higher and lower, right? And that's because of the point just below about how appraisals are updated continuously. So there's an iterative process. So I want to remind you of the appraisal theory of stress, right? So the primary appraisal is when I have to be aware that something is happening that is a threat to my well-being. Certainly a terminal diagnosis and a terminal illness is a threat to our well-being. But then I also have the secondary appraisal, which is my appraisal of how much I can handle this and deal with it. And obviously, I might understand that I can't cure myself, but I still might have appraisals related to whether I'm going to actually be able to cope with my own mortality and accept it, and also do all of those things that I got to do as part of the dying role. And so all of those things can be various sources of stress, depending, of course, on my secondary appraisals. But these are updated continuously. So as the stress levels change, back to the reciprocity point, this now causes me to adopt coping styles. And I might have to experiment and adopt new coping styles. We talked about that in the previous video as I'm dealing with novel stressors. These will sometimes work, which will cause a feedback loop to say that, okay, this is working for me, so I'm going to do more of this, and that's going to maybe lower my stress. And so there's this back and forth between my stress goes up, but I invoke certain coping styles, and that helps my stress go down, and that maybe works for a while until some stress comes back because of other changes. So I keep using those same coping styles because they were working, and so this is working fine. Sometimes, though, the new coping styles that I try out don't always work. And so therefore, that causes another different kind of feedback loop where I try this and it doesn't work and my stress gets worse. And so then I got to keep trying something else. Sometimes I might learn a new coping style and it works at first, but as the disease progresses and maybe gets worse, it stops working. So then I have to readapt. So this is that reciprocity point, right? There's transactions between what I'm doing and what's happening to me as a result, in life, and this back and forth that's happening is dynamic, and it's not going to stay fixed all the time. It's not going to stay the same all the time. Context, the third point here, remains pretty critical, right? Another way to think about context here is what's happening with your treatment and your prognosis, right? So you're going to start taking medications. You're going to start receiving other kinds of treatments, perhaps. There's going to be some variability in this. Treatments also have side effects. The effectiveness is going to vary. And so that means that your ability to adjust and adapt is going to depend on things like how successful are the treatments, how severe are the side effects, is it predictable when you're going to experience certain side effects, right? Like some medications might cause nausea. So if you're able to predict when that's going to happen, like the day after you take it or something like that, then you're able to maybe anticipate and adapt for these kinds of things. Sometimes, though, it might be more unpredictable. Again, with social support, so what's going on with our primary caregiver, our family who's taking care of us or helping to take care of us at home. So this is called the patient caregiver dyad. And this is a dynamical process as well, right? Just like a person has no training for how to adopt the dying role, a person also has no training for how to adopt a caregiving role necessarily. Of course, they can go get some education on this as well. But, like a lot of things in life, like with parenting, right, there's not a manual necessarily, and we don't get training for these kinds of things. Things just happen to us, and we have to start learning on the fly. And so the dynamic of the patient caregiver dyad is something that's going to self-organize, right? The two people involved, or sometimes more than two people, are going to have to start figuring things out as a duo here, right? As they interact with each other here. So what we're seeing here then is a multi-level interaction, right? We have all of the biological factors related to how much someone feels in control of their symptoms and their treatments, and how they perceive and even experience their symptoms. The psychological side of things in terms of how this affects my identity, in terms of the sick role, the dying role, how I'm coping with all of these changes, and then how this affects my social connection to others in terms of changes to my social role as a spouse or parent or grandparent or any of these things. All of those things are interacting with each other in a very complex way across person, environment, physical and social environment. So our dynamic theory of adjustment one is one that has to account for all of that complexity. There's not a single story to tell here, right? But rather just to the idea that there's a lot of complexity going on to the whole thing. To wrap it up, now we need to talk about grief and bereavement. So here we're talking about, especially with bereavement, is the idea of how do people deal with the grief after a loved one has died. And so this is usually where Kubler-Ross gets invoked, as typically it's been described as a way of dealing with the grief that one faces after a loved one has passed away. But as I was noting earlier, we can also talk about applying these stages to a person who has a terminal illness and is now facing their own, potential mortality there. So while we can re-invoke Kubler-Ross here, again, I want to reiterate that it's a fair approximation sometimes, but it doesn't always apply, and that the process of going through grief and bereavement is also dynamic. It's also going to be very much tailored to the individual and their environment and their culture and all these factors that we've already listed here. I do have here, though, a straightforward list, I guess, of these dimensions of grief, right? So obviously the emotional side effect is the first one, an obvious one here. So the emotions associated with grief can be somewhat variable there, but mostly ones that we would expect to see here. It's also important to talk about the cognitions associated with grief. Here, what we're talking about is that it's a form of stress. And we know that stress is disruptive of cognition. So that means that we can look at having memory problems because cortisol impacts the hippocampus. We can have other concentration problems, and not just because of the stress hormone, but merely because of the fact that in dealing with grief, becomes something that just occupies our minds consistently, right? That I can't seem to stop thinking about the fact that I'm never going to see this person again, right? And those kinds of thoughts are hard to lose, right? This is like right in the forefront of our mind all day long. And that makes it hard to concentrate on doing anything else, right? You maybe after the person has passed away, you're going to try to get back to normality and go to work. But again, you're going to find that you're sitting somewhere at work and your mind is still on what just happened, right? And you can't focus. So that's a cognitive side effect here of the grief. The stress, of course, can have these physical effects. So that might mean sleep problems, right? Especially insomnia. Again, you're just going to be wide awake thinking about all these types of things. But again, we know that stress can disrupt sleep hormones. It disrupts the parasympathetic nervous system and the rest and digest systems. So that means disruptions of metabolic systems and appetite. All of the stuff we talked about in the previous video on psychoneuroimmunology becomes relevant here for any person who is going through a bereavement process. It's also worthwhile here to distinguish between the different forms of grief, right? So there's acute grief, which is, when you get the news that someone has died, you can have this very strong initial reaction, right? And it's very, very upsetting. So that's the initial shock part of it, right? Just acute, strong, sudden onset, terrible news has come in, and now I am overwhelmed with grief, right? Uh, but then there's also integrated grief. So at some point, we're able to try to start adapting and not be so completely overwhelmed with it. And we're going to start trying to go back to doing normal things with our lives. But at the same time, like I just noted, we still are going to have these thoughts, right? And so that means we are integrating the grief with our daily functioning at this point. That's why it's called integrated grief. It's also worth pointing out that there is such a thing called anticipatory grief. So the fact that, if I know a family member uh, is facing a terminal diagnosis, then I'm anticipating, and I can even imagine, and I can just start to see it in my head of okay, that this person's going to die, and I'm imagining this, and it's causing me grief just to even think about it. And so this, of course, then is anticipatory grief. So this grief occurs before the event, of course, right? So dealing with this, again, coping strategies, we talked all about the coping strategies already, so I don't need to reiterate all of that, but we want to reinvoke the idea that we may need new, better coping styles and strategies for these kinds of situations than the sort of things that we've done for simple transient stressors that we deal with when we're younger necessarily. Social support and the stress buffering hypothesis, again, pretty critical. And last, one more time with the meaning making, right? Like Viktor Frankl, I mentioned in the previous chapter, man's search for meaning and logotherapy, finding meaning in all of this. And of course, finding meaning in life ultimately becomes one of the bigger themes of existential psychology because what we all know as human beings. This is what the philosopher Heidegger referred to as Dasein. Uh, we are self-aware, and we know that we exist, and we have a certain presence in reality as a result. But as part of our awareness, we are of our own existence and our presence in the world. We are also aware of our future non-existence. That is, we know that our lives are temporary and that we will at some point expire and pass away. And how do we reconcile that knowledge with living a life, right? And knowing, of course, that even as we live our lives, we're going to go through a variety of different stages and phases where suffering and grief and bad things are happening to us, interspersed with a lot of good things too. And so we could treat this as something that is meaningless. We could be a nihilist. We could be an absurdist and think that it's all just a terrible joke. These are different views that existential philosophers and psychologists have proposed in the last couple of centuries. But the broader point is that we can make these choices for ourselves in terms of determining our own meaning for our lives and finding that, all right, and understanding that this is my life to lead and I get to have some control over it and make choices for myself. That's kind of the bigger, broader theme for this kind of meaning making business. And I think it applies not just to what we're talking about on this slide and in this last chapter, but just in general across all of the different dimensions of the phases of life and everything that we go through in life. So with that, I think that is a good enough way to end the course. So as always, let me know if you have questions.